She thought she was throwing out a broken old man. My daughter-in-law stood there in the doorway of the house she had redecorated with my credit card. Arms folded, lip curled, looking at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you've decided to get rid of. My son stood 2 steps behind her, eyes on the floor, silent. He had been silent for a long time by then. That was her work too. She said, "This isn't working anymore, Gerald. Not Pa, not Dad, Gerald." Like I was a contractor who had failed to deliver. It was the Sunday before Thanksgiving. The turkey was already thawing in the refrigerator downstairs. The refrigerator I had bought. In the house I had bought. On the street I had lived on for 31 years. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I had spent the last 4 months preparing for exactly this moment. Let me go back to the beginning, because this story doesn't make sense unless you understand who I was before they decided I was no longer useful. My name is Gerald. I'm 64 years old. I spent 37 years building a commercial landscaping company from a single truck and a push mower I bought secondhand from a neighbor who was moving to Florida. By the time I was 55, we had 42 employees, contracts with 3 hospital systems, a university, and more office parks than I could count. I was not a flashy man. I drove a Ford F-150. I wore Carhartt jackets. I ate lunch at diners. I did not talk about money because my father had taught me that men who talk about money are usually the ones who don't have any. My wife, Patricia, passed 8 years ago. Breast cancer. She was 53. After she died, the house got very quiet, and I made the mistake that a lot of lonely fathers make. I leaned too hard on my son. My son's name is Daniel. He was 31 when his mother died. Good-looking kid. Always had been. Smart enough, though he had never quite figured out what to do with it. He had bounced between jobs, sales, property management, a brief and disastrous attempt at starting an online business that I had quietly funded and quietly watched fail. I never made him feel bad about any of it. Patricia would have wanted me to be patient with him, so I was patient. Then he met Renee. Renee was attractive, sharp, and hungry in a way that had nothing to do with ambition and everything to do with acquisition. She had grown up in a house with not much money and had decided that the solution to that problem was to attach herself to someone who had some. I could see it the first night Daniel brought her to dinner. She spent the entire meal looking at the house. Not at me, not at Daniel, at the house. The crown molding, the built-ins in the living room, the size of the kitchen. She was appraising the place like she was already drawing up plans. I said nothing. Daniel was happy for the first time in years, and I was not going to be the father who takes that away from his son. They got married 14 months later. Small wedding, which I paid for. Then they moved in with me, which was supposed to be temporary, just until they saved enough for a down payment on their own place. That was 3 years before she stood in the doorway and told me this wasn't working anymore. In those 3 years, Renee had slowly and methodically rearranged my life to suit herself. She redecorated 2 rooms, which I allowed. She started hosting dinner parties for her friends without asking me, which I tolerated. She began making comments at the table, little ones, the kind you couldn't quite call rude, but that accumulated over time like water damage. Comments about how I was set in my ways. Comments about how the house could really open up if certain walls came down. Comments, mostly directed at Daniel but clearly meant for me, about how different things would be once they had their own space. Then, 8 months before Thanksgiving, I sold my company. I had been approached by a regional acquisitions firm that had been circling us for 2 years. The number they eventually put on the table was more than I had ever expected to see in my lifetime. I won't say the exact figure, but I will say that after taxes, after the accountant, after everything was settled and the wire transfers cleared, I sat in my car in the parking lot of my bank and cried for about 20 minutes. Not from sadness, from the strange, disorienting feeling of arriving somewhere you had been walking toward for 40 years without ever quite knowing what it would feel like. I told no one, not Daniel, not Renee, not my sister in Columbus. I had a reason for that, and the reason was a conversation I had overheard 6 weeks earlier. I had come home early from a meeting that had run short. The front door was unlocked, and I let myself in quietly, the way you do in your own house when you don't want to disrupt anything. I heard voices in the kitchen, Daniel and Renee, talking in that low, frank register that people use when they think they're alone. Renee was saying that they needed to accelerate the timeline. Daniel asked what that meant. She said it meant that they needed to start making moves on the house, that Gerald wasn't getting younger, that the market was good right now, and that if they waited until something actually happened to him, it would get complicated with probate and whatever else was in his will. She said they should start talking to him about a quitclaim deed. She said they should frame it as simplifying things, making it easier on everyone. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He's not going to go for that," Renee said. "Then we make him want to." I stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then I walked back out the front door, got in my truck, and drove to the diner on Route 9, where I had been eating lunch for 20 years. I ordered coffee and a slice of pie, and I sat there for 2 hours, thinking. I thought about Patricia, who had loved that house and planted the rose bushes along the back fence and painted the front door that particular shade of blue herself, on a ladder, on a Saturday morning in April. I thought about Daniel as a little boy, sitting on the kitchen counter while Patricia made pancakes. I thought about what it meant that my son was standing in that kitchen having that conversation. And then I stopped feeling sorry for myself and started making a plan. The first thing I did was call my attorney, a woman named Sandra who had been handling my business affairs for 15 years and who I trusted completely. I told her what I had heard. I told her about the sale of the company. I told her I wanted to make sure the house, and everything in it, and everything attached to my name, was properly structured so that no one could make a move on it without my explicit direction. Sandra spent 3 weeks on it. When she was done, the house was held in a trust with specific conditions. The contents of my accounts were restructured. A separate account was opened for my granddaughter. My granddaughter's name is Maya. She is 7 years old. She has Patricia's eyes and a laugh that can reorganize a room. She is the reason I had stayed as long as I did, and she is the reason I had to be careful about how any of this ended. Over the following weeks, Renee began the campaign she had promised Daniel she would run. It was subtle at first. Comments about how the house was too big for one person. Suggestions that I might be more comfortable somewhere smaller, somewhere with a community, somewhere with people my own age. Then came the mention casual, over dinner, as if the thought had just occurred to her of a very nice senior living community about 40 minutes north. She had driven past it, she said. It looked lovely, very well maintained. I nodded and said it did sound nice. The next week she had a brochure. The week after that she had made an appointment for a tour that she had somehow booked without asking me. I canceled the appointment. I said I wasn't ready to think about that. She smiled the smile of a woman filing information away for later use. Then I made my own move. I quietly leased a condominium on the other side of town. 2 bedrooms, high floor, corner unit, view of the river. I furnished it over 3 weekends while Daniel and Renee were visiting her mother. I moved my most important things there in boxes, a few at a time. My financial documents, Patricia's jewelry, which I put in a lockbox, the photographs I couldn't replace, the quilt Patricia had made when Daniel was a baby. I was ready before they were. The Sunday before Thanksgiving arrived like most Sundays had been arriving for the past several months, with a low, gray tension that everyone pretended not to feel. I came downstairs to find Renee at the kitchen table with her laptop open and Daniel standing at the coffee machine looking at nothing in particular. Renee looked up and said, "Gerald, we need to talk to you about something." I sat down. I said, "All right." She had clearly prepared. She talked about the house being underutilized, about the property taxes being a burden, about how it would make more sense for everyone if the deed was transferred into a joint arrangement, something that would allow them to refinance and pull out equity for a down payment on an investment property they had been looking at in Scottsdale. She said it would benefit me too, because they would continue to handle the household expenses, the utilities, the maintenance, which I must admit had become a lot for one person. I let her finish. Then I asked Daniel if these were his thoughts too. He didn't answer right away. He looked at his coffee. Then he said, "It makes sense, Pa. It's just practical." Practical. His mother's house. The house where I had carried him in from the hospital 28 years ago. Practical. I said I would need some time to think about it. Renee said she understood, but that they were hoping to have an answer before the end of the month, because the property in Scottsdale was getting interest from other buyers. I said I would do my best. I went upstairs and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I looked at the photograph of Patricia on the nightstand. I talked to her for a little while, the way I had been talking to her since she died. I told her I was sorry it had come to this. I told her I was going to make sure Maya was taken care of. I told her the rose bushes along the back fence looked good this year, and I had been keeping them up the way she liked. Then I went downstairs and I called Sandra. She said everything was in order. She asked if I was sure. I said I was. That evening, I called my old friend Raymond, who had helped me with the landscaping company in the early years, and who was now retired and living in Savannah, and who had agreed, when I asked him 2 months earlier, to be available if I needed a place to be for a few days while things settled. He said the guest room was ready. I said I might need it sooner than expected. The next morning I made breakfast for Maya before she went to school. Scrambled eggs, the way she liked them, with cheese. I braided her hair, which I had learned to do after Renee started working part-time and there were mornings no one else was available. Maya sat on the kitchen stool and talked to me about her friend at school, whose dog had had puppies, and whether I thought a dog would be happy living in a house without a yard. I said I thought a dog could be happy anywhere, as long as the people around it were kind. She said, "Papa, are you okay?" I said I was just fine. I said I had some things to sort out, but that everything was going to be all right. She seemed to accept that. 7-year-olds have a kind of faith in adults that you either honor or you don't. I intended to honor it. That afternoon, I called Sandra one more time to confirm that the documents related to Maya's account had been filed, that the education trust was properly structured, and that the letters I had written, one for Daniel, one for Renee, one for my attorney to hold until needed, were in the correct hands. Sandra confirmed everything. She said she hoped I was doing all right. I said I was better than I had been in months. When Daniel came home from work that evening, I was in the living room. Renee was beside him before he had his coat off, which told me she had been watching for his car. She said she wanted to circle back on the conversation from yesterday. She said she had looked at the numbers again and really, the sooner we moved on this, the better for everyone. Daniel looked at me. I think he expected me to negotiate, or to push back, or to ask for more time. Instead, I said, I need to tell you both something. I told them the house was in a trust. I told them that the trust had been structured in a way that made any transfer of the deed without my explicit, notarized consent legally impossible. I told them that I was aware of the conversation they had in this kitchen 6 weeks ago, and that I was aware it was not the first conversation of that kind they had had. I told them that I had sold my company, and that while I did not owe them the details of my financial situation, they should understand that the picture they had been working from was not accurate. The room was very quiet. Renee's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. I watched them come and go. Daniel said, "Pa." I said, "I'm not finished." I told them that I had arranged for myself to be elsewhere, and that they would have 30 days to make alternative housing arrangements, at which point I would need the house back. I told them that I had set aside a reasonable sum to assist with a security deposit and first month's rent somewhere suitable, and that this amount would be made available through Sandra's office. I told them that I wished things had gone differently, and that I meant that sincerely. Then I told Daniel that I loved him, and that I would always love him, and that the love I had for him was entirely separate from the business decisions I was making that evening, and that when he was ready to have a real conversation not about the house, not about money, but about us, I would be available. I picked up the bag I had packed and left by the front door 2 days earlier. I walked out. I stayed with Raymond in Savannah for 9 days. He was good company. We ate well, watched football, sat on the back porch in the evenings and talked about the years when everything was still ahead of us and we didn't know what that meant yet. I slept better than I had in 2 years. On the 4th day, Sandra called. Renee had retained an attorney and was exploring whether the trust was contestable. Sandra said it was not. Renee's attorney apparently agreed, because by the end of the week they had withdrawn. On the 7th day, Daniel called. Not Renee, Daniel. He called from what I could tell was the parking lot of his office, because I could hear the background sounds of a space that wasn't home. He didn't say much at first. He said he didn't know I had overheard them. I said I knew. He asked me how long I had known. I said long enough. He was quiet for a while. Then he said that he knew what he had done was wrong. Not exactly those words, but close enough. He said that he had let things go in a direction he shouldn't have let them go, and that he had told himself it was practical, and that it was what adults did, and that he had known, somewhere, that it wasn't right. I said I appreciated him saying that. He asked about Maya. I told him Maya was fine, that the trust for her education was fully funded, and that my relationship with her was not contingent on anything that had happened between him and me, and that it never would be. He started to cry. Not loudly. Just the sound of a man who has been holding something in and suddenly isn't anymore. I had not heard my son cry since his mother's funeral. I let him. I didn't try to fix it or rush it. I just stayed on the line. When he was done, I said that we had time. I said that I was not going anywhere and neither was he, and that we didn't have to solve everything on a phone call in a parking lot in November. I said there was a diner near my new place that made a good breakfast, and that if he wanted to come by sometime, we could eat and talk like normal people. He said he'd like that. I said good. The 30 days ran their course. Sandra coordinated with a moving company on the logistics. Renee and Daniel found an apartment, a 2-bedroom, in a complex closer to her office. It was a reasonable place. I did not begrudge them the help I had offered, and I made sure Sandra dispersed it without comment. The week they moved out, I went back to the house for the first time. I walked through every room. The redecorating Renee had done was fine. Honestly, she had good taste. Whatever else could be said about her. I stopped in the kitchen and looked at the counter where a 7-year-old Patricia had sat on Saturday mornings. I looked at the back fence where the rose bushes were resting for the winter, bare and brown but alive underneath. I stood there for a long time. Then I made a list of everything I wanted to plant in the spring. Maya came over for Thanksgiving that year. Daniel brought her and stayed for dinner. The two of them and me and Raymond, who had driven up for the occasion. Renee did not come. That was her choice, and I respected it. There would be time, or there wouldn't. I couldn't control that. What I could control was the table I set. The pie I ordered from the bakery Patricia had always used. The way I braided Maya's hair before dinner while she told me about the puppy her friend's dog had finally had. A small brown one with white paws, and whether she thought it would be happy in an apartment. I said I thought a dog could be happy anywhere, as long as the people around it were kind. She looked up at me in the mirror, the way Patricia used to look at me when she thought I was saying something worth remembering. "You already told me that, Papa," she said. I said I know. I said sometimes things are worth saying twice. She laughed, and the room reorganized itself around the sound of it, and I thought that this particular moment, this ordinary evening before a holiday in the house where I had lived for 31 years, was exactly what I had been protecting all along. Not the trust, not the money, not the property value, or the deed, or any of the machinery I had put in place to make sure no one could take anything from me. This. Just this. The candles on the table, the smell of the turkey in the oven, the sound of my son and my old friend talking in the other room, the small, warm weight of my granddaughter's head leaning against my arm as I finished the last braid. Renee had thought she was dealing with a man who had nothing left to fight for. She had looked at me and seen someone whose best years were behind him, someone who could be moved around like furniture, arranged to suit a plan he didn't even know he was part of. What she had never understood, what I had never needed to explain, because it wasn't the kind of thing you explain to someone who is already counting your square footage, was that I had spent 64 years learning exactly what mattered and exactly what didn't. And I knew the difference. If you've ever had to stand your ground with the people closest to you, you know what I mean. It doesn't feel the way the movies make it look. It doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like grief and love all tangled together, like something that costs you even when you know it was right. But you stand up anyway, because some things are worth it, because some people are worth it, because you made a promise to a woman with Patricia's eyes and you intend to keep it. I kept it.